On his 40th birthday, my son forgot to hang up the phone. I was about to disconnect when I heard him tell his wife he was sick of that old woman and planned to ship me to a nursing home. He never knew I heard, and he wouldn't find out until the day my will was read what that sentence truly cost him. Please, before you listen to this wonderful story, write from what city, state, or country you are watching me. It is very important for me that I collect stories of hearts from your native places. The second Tuesday in May had always been a sacred day on my calendar. It was the day my Daniel was born, the day my world had shifted on its axis and rearranged itself around a tiny, perfect human being. For 40 years, that day had been a celebration of the profound, all-consuming love I felt for my son. My husband, Michael, and I had poured our entire lives into that boy. We were not wealthy people, but we made sure Daniel never wanted for anything that truly mattered. We worked extra shifts, Michael at the plant, me as a bookkeeper, to pay for tutors, for summer camps, for the state university that would give him a future we could only dream of. Every sacrifice was a joy. Every dollar spent an investment in the wonderful man we were certain he would become. Now, at 72, with Michael gone for 5 years, those memories were the bedrock of my quiet life. Daniel lived in a different state. A successful architect with a busy life and a sophisticated wife, Sarah. I understood. I never burdened him. His visits were rare, reserved for Thanksgiving and Christmas, carefully scheduled events of polite conversation and slightly strained cheerfulness. I knew he was busy, and I cherished the brief moments we had, but the birthday phone call was different. It was our special tradition. It was the one time of year it felt like it was just the two of us again, a mother and her son, unburdened by the expectations of holidays or the presence of others. This year was special, 40. It was a monumental milestone, the official crest of the hill of life. I had woken up that morning with a flutter of nervous excitement, the same I'd felt when he was turning 5 and I was planning his superhero-themed party. I spent the morning baking his favorite cake, a rich, dark chocolate with raspberry filling, even though he was 1,000 miles away. I knew I'd just eat a slice myself and give the rest to my neighbors, but the act of baking it was a ritual of love, a way of feeling close to him. I waited until the evening, after I knew he'd be home from work and would have celebrated with Sarah. When I dialed his number, he answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey, Mom. I was hoping you'd call." My heart swelled. We talked for nearly an hour, the conversation easy and warm. I told him about my garden, about the new book I was reading. He told me about a big project he had just landed at work, a new skyscraper that was going to be the talk of the city. I could hear the pride in his voice, and it made me feel like I was bursting with it myself. 40 years old, Danny, I said, my voice thick with emotion as I reverted to his childhood nickname. I can still remember holding you for the first time. You were so small and you had a full head of black hair. Your father and I, we were just so in awe of you. I know, Mom, he said, and he sounded genuinely touched. Thanks for everything. You and Dad, you gave me the perfect childhood. We said our goodbyes, the conversation ending with the familiar, comforting exchange of I love yous. I love you too, Mom. Talk to you soon. I love you more, my sweet boy. Have a wonderful night. I smiled, my heart full to the brim. It was everything I had hoped for. I was about to hang up the phone, my thumb hovering over the red button, when I heard a rustling sound on the other end of the line, and then a voice that was not my son's. It was his wife, Sarah, her voice crisp and clear. Finally, she said with an exasperated sigh. Is she done? I thought she was going to recite your entire life story. My thumb froze. I couldn't breathe. My entire body went cold. He hadn't hung up the phone, and then I heard it. The sentence that would shatter my world into a million irreparable pieces. It was my son's voice, but it was a voice I had never heard before. It was cold, dismissive, and filled with a weary cruelty that was as sharp as a shard of glass. God, I know. He sighed, and I could practically hear him rolling his eyes. I'm going to have to talk to her doctor about getting her affairs in order. I'm sending her to a nursing home as soon as we can find a decent one. I'm so sick of that old woman. The world didn't so much as tilt as it did completely invert, flipping me upside down and shaking the very soul from my body. For a long, silent moment, I stood frozen in my own kitchen, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air on the line where my son's love had been just moments before. My thumb, of its own accord, finally pressed the end call button. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, not with a crash, but with a soft, dull thud as it landed in the cradle, a sound of absolute finality. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter to keep myself from collapsing. The air grew thick and heavy, each breath a painful, shallow gasp. On the counter, the chocolate cake I had so lovingly baked sat under a glass dome, a monument to my own foolish, boundless affection. The rich, sweet smell of it, which had brought me such joy that morning, now filled my throat with the bitter taste of bile. My son's words, I'm so sick of that old woman, were not just words. They were a poison, a venom that didn't just hurt me in the present, but seeped backward in time, contaminating every single cherished memory I had of him. My life's album, once filled with vibrant, happy snapshots, was now being torched, page by page. I saw him at age 7, his face pale with fever, and remembered holding his small, hot body all through the night, singing him lullabies. Had he been secretly wishing I would just put him down and leave him alone? I saw him at 22, a proud figure in his cap and gown at his college graduation. My own and Michael's faces beaming with a pride so immense it felt like our hearts would burst. Had he been scanning the crowd, embarrassed by his father's work-worn hands and my simple off-the-rack dress? The most recent visit, last Christmas, now played in my mind like a horror film. His hugs had felt so warm, his laughter at the dinner table so genuine. He had looked me in the eye and told me he loved me as he left. Was it all a lie? A masterful performance by a man simply placating the inconvenient old woman he had to endure twice a year? The love I thought was the unshakable foundation of my life was a facade, a hollow movie set, and I had just accidentally stumbled behind the curtain to see the cheap, rotting wood that held it all up. I was a fool. A 60-year-old woman's love had been reduced to a 60-second-a-year chore for him, and I had been too blind, too desperate to see it. I stumbled into the living room and sank into Michael's old armchair. The house, my sanctuary, was now a museum of my own delusion. Every framed photograph on the mantelpiece, Daniel on his first bicycle, Daniel at his wedding, Daniel holding a trophy, seemed to mock me. Every piece of his childhood art I had so carefully preserved on the refrigerator was a testament to a love that had only ever flowed in one direction. The pain was not a clean, sharp wound. It was a crushing, suffocating weight, the feeling of being buried alive under the rubble of my own life. It was the humiliation, the absolute soul-crushing humiliation of it all. I had dedicated my entire existence to a son who didn't just not appreciate it, he actively resented me for it. My love was not his treasure, it was his burden. I did not cry. The shock was a dam holding back an ocean of grief. I just sat there in the growing darkness as the sun set outside, my mind replaying the words, the tone, the casual cruelty of it all. I'm sending her to a nursing home. He had been planning my disposal. I was not his mother. I was a problem to be managed, a piece of old furniture to be stored away when it was no longer useful. I tried to find a reason, to understand what I had done to create such a monster. Had I loved him too much? Had my sacrifices smothered him? Had I raised a man so insulated by my love that he had never learned to feel any of his own? Or was this his wife, Sarah? Had her sophisticated, cold ambition poisoned him against his simple, working-class mother? It didn't matter. The end result was the same. The son I had raised was gone. In his place was a cold, calculating stranger. The dam finally broke in the dead of night. It wasn't a loud, theatrical sobbing, but a quiet, hopeless weeping that seemed to have no end. I cried for my dead husband who had worked himself into an early grave for a son who held him in contempt. I cried for the little boy with the black hair who had disappeared somewhere along the road to his 40th birthday. And I cried for myself, for the woman who had given everything and had been left with absolutely nothing. As the first pale rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, the storm of tears subsided, leaving a desolate, cold calm in its wake. The chaotic grief was beginning to crystallize into a single, hard, and undeniable truth. The relationship I thought I had with my son was a complete and utter lie. He would continue to call. He would visit at Thanksgiving. And it would all be a charade. I walked into the bathroom and looked at my reflection. My face was pale and puffy, my eyes red-rimmed. For the first time I saw what my son saw, a tired, old woman. He was right. I was tired. I was too tired to fight him, too tired to scream and rage and demand an explanation that would only be met with more lies and false apologies. I had no strength left for a war of words. The loving mother in me, though mortally wounded, would probably just end up forgiving him, and the sick, twisted cycle would continue. But as I stood there, a cold, quiet thought bloomed in the barren landscape of my heart. A fight was not necessary. He had made his plans for my future without my knowledge. It was only fair that I should make mine for his. The days that followed the phone call bled into one another in a grayscale of quiet, secret grief. I moved through my life like a well-rehearsed automaton, a ghost in my own home. I'd wake, make coffee, tend to my garden, and exchange pleasantries with neighbors, a hollow smile permanently affixed to my face. But inside, a vast, echoing silence had taken root where my son's love used to be. Every photograph on the wall was a painful reminder, every memento a relic from a life I now knew to be a lie. My love for Daniel had been the sun in my solar system, and now that it had been extinguished, all the planets of my life spun cold and dark in the void. The grief was a solitary burden, a secret too shameful and devastating to share. How could I tell my friends that the son I had always spoken of with such pride saw me as a nuisance to be discarded? The humiliation was a physical barrier, locking the words in my throat. This isolation was deepest with my husband, Michael. He saw the change in me immediately. The light had gone out of my eyes. I'd stare into the distance for long periods, and he'd find me at night, sitting silently in the dark of the living room. "Evelyn, honey, what is it?" he'd ask, his voice thick with a worry that only deepened my own pain. "You haven't been yourself since Danny's birthday. Did something happen on the call? Did he say something to upset you?" And I would lie. It was the hardest, most painful lie I had ever told, but I told it to protect him. Michael had worked his body to the breaking point at the plant for 40 years, all for our son. His pride in Daniel was immense, a towering monument to his life's work. To tell him the truth, to share the casual, brutal cruelty of our son's words, would be to take a sledgehammer to the very foundation of his world. It would break his heart, and I would not do that to him. So I would force a smile and pat his hand. No, dear, of course not. The call was wonderful. I'm just feeling a bit tired these days, that's all. The lie was a heavy stone I swallowed every day, adding to the suffocating weight in my chest. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The initial raw agony began to cool, not into forgiveness, but into something much harder and more durable, a quiet, unshakable resolve. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was a lens. Through this new, clarifying lens, I looked at the life Michael and I had built. I saw our comfortable home, paid for with a lifetime of budgeting and sacrifice. I saw our savings, the nest egg we had so carefully constructed to ensure our final years would be lived in dignity without being a burden on anyone. All of it, every brick in the house, every dollar in the bank was earmarked for Daniel. It was his inheritance, his birthright. The thought of that inheritance now made me physically ill. I pictured Daniel and his wife Sarah after I was gone. I saw them using my money to pay the monthly fees on the decent nursing home they had planned for me. I saw them taking luxurious vacations, hosting lavish parties, living a life of ease, all funded by the life's work of the old woman they were so sick of. My sacrifice, my legacy would be nothing more than the fuel for their selfish, comfortable lives. The thought was not just painful, it was obscene. It was a violation. My love, my life's work, would not be used to reward the man who had so casually and completely broken my heart. My decision was not made in a moment of hot, vengeful anger. It was a slow, cold, and logical conclusion, reached after countless sleepless nights. I would not confront him. I would not fight. I would simply change the future. One Tuesday morning, after Michael had left for his weekly breakfast meeting with his retiree friends, I made a phone call. My hand was steady as I dialed the number for Mr. Gable, our family lawyer for over 30 years. He was a kind, gentle man who had known Daniel since he was a boy in Little League. His office was a familiar place of quiet comfort, smelling of old books and lemon polish. "Evelyn, so good to see you," he said, greeting me with a warm smile. "How is Michael? And how is the big 4-0 treating our Daniel? I trust he's celebrating in style." The casual, kind question was a small, sharp knife to the ribs, but I did not let the pain show on my face. "Everyone is well, thank you, Charles," I said, taking the seat opposite his large oak desk. "I am here today because I need to make a significant change to my will." His smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of professional concern. "Oh? Is everything all right? This is a bit sudden. Does Michael know you're here?" "What I do with my personal will is my own affair, as you know," I said, my voice polite but firm in a way that surprised even me. "I want to amend it. I want to remove Daniel as the primary beneficiary." Mr. Gable was visibly taken aback. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching my face for any sign of confusion or distress. "Evelyn, that is a very serious, very final step. I have to ask. May I know what brought this on? Has there been a disagreement? I would not air my family's pathetic, dirty laundry in his office. My pain was my own." "Let's just say," I said, my voice quiet but absolute, that I have come to believe I have given my son all that I am able to in this life. My legacy, upon my death, is a separate matter, and I have decided it will be directed elsewhere. My dignity, the quiet finality in my tone left no room for further questions. He nodded slowly, a sad understanding in his eyes. I see. And in his place, to whom shall the estate be left? I turned my head and looked out the large window of his second-story office. Directly across the street, bathed in the morning sun, was a handsome old brick building surrounded by a playground. It was the St. Jude's Children's Home, a place I had driven past 1,000 times. A place full of children who, like my Brenda in the previous story, knew the pain of being unwanted. An idea, so sudden, so perfect, so poetically just, bloomed in my mind. My own child had discarded my love. I would give everything I had to children who had no mother's love at all. I turned back to Mr. Gable. Everything, I said, my voice clear and strong. The house, the savings, every last penny, I want it all to go to St. Jude's. The children's home, the one right across the street from my house. I walked out of Mr. Gable's office, the crisp folded pages of the new will tucked securely in my purse. The document felt both as heavy as a gravestone and as light as a feather. I had just buried the son I thought I knew, the son I had loved beyond all reason. But in his place, I had planted a forest of new possibilities for children I would never meet, a legacy of hope born from the ashes of my own. I returned home, and the house felt different. It was no longer a future inheritance for a man who saw me as a burden. It was now a promise. Every brick, every floorboard, every dollar of its value was now a silent pledge to the children in the brick building across the street. That evening, I knew I could no longer carry the secret alone. The lie I had told to protect Michael was a corrosive acid, eating away at the edges of the honesty that had been the bedrock of our 50-year marriage. After dinner, as we sat in the living room with the television murmuring softly in the background, I turned to him. "Michael," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk. Something did happen on Danny's birthday call, something terrible." I told him everything. I recounted the warm, loving conversation and then the horrifying, accidental postscript. I repeated the words, the two sentences that had become a permanent, searing brand on my soul. As I spoke, I watched my husband's face. I saw the initial confusion, the dawning horror, and then a look of such profound, crushing heartbreak that it was almost more than I could bear. This was the pain I had been trying to spare him. Michael, a man of quiet strength who rarely showed emotion, did not speak. He simply stared at the blank television screen, and I saw two silent tears trace paths down his weathered cheeks. He was mourning the loss of a son he was still proud of. With a heavy heart, I then told him what I had done that morning. I told him about my visit to Mr. Gable, about the changes to the will, about my decision to leave everything to the children's home. I finished, my voice a whisper, and waited for his verdict, terrified that he would see my actions as a betrayal, an act of unforgivable vengeance. He sat in silence for a long, heavy minute. Then he slowly reached out and took my hand, his familiar calloused grip a source of immense comfort. He turned to look at me, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. "You did the right thing, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I could not name. He made his choice. This is our legacy. Everything we built together, it should go to someone who will cherish it. It should go to someone who needs it. In that moment, we were no longer two individuals grieving in isolation. We were a team again, united in our quiet sorrow and our shared resolve. The secret was no longer just mine to bear, it was ours. The years began to pass, marked by the steady rhythm of Daniel's biannual visits. He would arrive for Thanksgiving, a perfectly roasted, store-bought turkey in hand. He would arrive for Christmas, his arms laden with expensive, impersonal gifts. Cashmere scarves for me, a bottle of aged whiskey for Michael. He and Sarah would fill our small house with their loud, confident talk of their travels, their investments, their important friends. They would ask about our health with the same polite, detached interest one might inquire about the weather, and we, in turn, would play our parts. We would smile, we would thank them for the gifts, we would ask the appropriate questions and feign interest in their glittering, hollow world. Each visit was a masterpiece of unspoken tragedy. I would watch my son, this handsome, successful, 50-year-old stranger, and see through the charming facade to the cold, selfish heart beneath. I saw the subtle impatience in his eyes as I told a story he'd heard before. I saw the way he discreetly checked his phone under the dinner table when he thought we weren't looking. He was performing his duty, checking the box of the loving son, all the while completely, blissfully unaware that he was a ghost at the feast, a disinherited prince paying court to the parents whose legacy he had already lost. During those years, as our connection to our own child became a hollow performance, our connection to our new heirs became quietly, profoundly real. I started volunteering at the St. Jude's Children's Home. At first, I just helped in the office, but soon I found my place in the library reading stories to the younger children. These were children who had known the harsh sting of abandonment, yet their capacity for trust and affection was boundless. They would lean against me, their small heads resting on my arm, their eyes wide as I read to them of magical lands and brave heroes. They called me Miss Evelyn, and their simple, uncomplicated affection was a balm to my wounded soul. Michael, whose health was beginning to fail, would come with me sometimes, sitting in a comfortable chair while the children gathered around him. He, a man of few words, would simply listen, a small, gentle smile on his face. Anonymously, we funded a complete renovation of their playground and later, a new wing for their small library. Our house, the one Daniel assumed he would one day own, became our vantage point. We would sit on our porch in the evenings and look across the street at the brightly lit windows of the children's home, at the new playground bustling with activity. We were watching our true legacy grow, a legacy built not on blood but on a choice. 10 years. For a decade, we lived inside this quiet, heartbreaking lie. Daniel was now preparing for his annual Christmas visit, oblivious. He would come bearing his usual expensive whiskey and cashmere, ready to perform his duty as a loving son. He did not know he would be visiting a father he would never see again, and a mother whose final devastating word had already been written, sealed, and was waiting silently for him in a lawyer's office for 10 long, patient years. That final Christmas was a masterpiece of hollow traditions. Daniel and Sarah arrived, their expensive SUV pulling into the driveway, looking like visitors from another, glossier planet. They came bearing gifts wrapped in glittering paper, their arms laden with the obligatory offerings of a dutiful son. For me, a cashmere sweater in a bland beige color that was not my style. For Michael, a bottle of obscenely expensive whiskey that his failing health would never allow him to drink. We accepted them with polite smiles, the four of us performing a tired, brittle play for an audience of ghosts. Michael was visibly frail, a shadow of the vibrant man he had once been. He sat in his armchair, a blanket over his knees, and listened as Daniel recounted his recent successes: a new business deal, a trip to Europe, the purchase of a new luxury car. Daniel spoke with an air of breezy accomplishment, completely oblivious to the profound, tragic irony of boasting about his wealth to the parents, whose own future he had so carelessly decimated. At one point, he placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Don't you worry about Mom, Dad," he said with a confident, reassuring smile. "Sarah and I will always make sure she's taken care of. You just focus on getting better." Michael didn't respond. He simply looked over Daniel's head at me, and in that one brief, shared glance, a universe of unspoken sorrow passed between us. This was our final performance, the last time the four of us would sit in this room and pretend to be a family. When they left, Daniel gave his father a quick, almost clumsy hug, a gesture of duty rather than love, never suspecting it was the last time he would ever see him alive. He kissed me on the cheek, the touch as brief and cool as a winter breeze. "Promise you'll call more often," I said, the words a reflex from a lifetime of being his mother. "Of course, Mom." "I promise," he lied, and then he was gone. Michael passed away in the soft gray light of a March morning, peacefully, in his sleep. My grief was profound. A deep, quiet ache for the loss of my partner, my friend, my other half. But it was a clean grief, a sorrow untainted by the poison of betrayal. It was the natural, heartbreaking conclusion to a long and loving life shared. I called Daniel to tell him. His reaction was a portrait of predictable, logistical sorrow. There was a sharp intake of breath, a performative, "Oh, Mom, no, I'm so sorry." And then, almost immediately, the practicalities. Okay, let me look at flights. When will the service be? I'll have to move some meetings around. Just let me know what you need me to do." His grief was an item on his to-do list, a problem to be managed. At the funeral, he played the part of the grieving son beautifully. He stood by my side, his arm around my shoulders, accepting condolences with a somber, handsome face. He even gave a eulogy, a well-written, generic tribute to a father he had barely known, filled with vague platitudes about strength and integrity. As I sat in the front pew, listening to the son whose actions had undoubtedly hastened his father's death praise him in a church full of our friends and family, I felt a sense of detachment so profound it was almost an out-of-body experience. I was watching a play, and the lead actor was a stranger. After Michael was gone, my own world began to shrink. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, gentle fading. The house felt too big, the silence too loud. My friends and neighbors were kind, but their pity was a constant reminder of my loss. My only true joy, my only real purpose, was across the street. I poured what was left of my life and my love into the children at St. Jude's. I was there every day, a beloved fixture, a grandmother to children who had none. My legacy was no longer a future promise stored in a bank account. It was a living, breathing thing I could see and touch every day in the smiles and laughter of the children on the playground Michael and I had funded. My phone conversations with Daniel became a weekly ritual of polite fiction. He would call every Sunday evening, a duty-bound check-in. The calls were brief, scripted, and utterly devoid of any real connection. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "I'm all right, dear. A little tired today." "You should be taking it easy. That's a big house for you to manage all on your own." "I manage." "I know, but Sarah and I were just talking. It might be time to start thinking about the future." looking into some of those nice managed care communities, just to have a plan in place, you know? The first time he said it, my blood ran cold. The sheer breathtaking obliviousness of it. 10 years after I had overheard him map out my future in a nursing home, here he was, openly suggesting it himself, believing it to be a new, sensible idea. He was still the same man, the same cold, practical stranger, already planning my disposal before I was even gone. The conversation didn't anger me anymore. It simply confirmed, with a sad, weary finality, the absolute rightness of the decision I had made in Mr. Gable's office all those years ago. I knew my time was short. My heart, which had been broken so many times, was finally, truly getting tired. One last time I visited Mr. Gable. I was frail now, leaning on a cane, but my mind was as clear as it had ever been. We reviewed the will. It was unchanged. The letter I had written a decade before was still there, sealed in its crisp white envelope, waiting patiently for its recipient. I spent my final days in peace, sitting on my porch, watching the children across the street. The curtain on my long, quiet play was about to fall. I had written the final scene myself, a masterpiece of devastating poetic justice. All that was left was for the main character to arrive, take his seat in the front row, and finally discover that the entire play had been about him, and he was the villain. That last Christmas was, in its own way, a perfect goodbye. It was the last time I would have to wear the heavy costume of the loving, oblivious mother, and the last time he would have to perform the tired, hollow role of the dutiful son. A few months later, Michael passed away. A quiet and gentle end to a long and loving life. My own grief was immense, a profound loneliness that settled deep in my bones. But it was a clean grief, the natural sorrow of a wife who had lost her husband, untainted by the bitter poison of betrayal. At his funeral, Daniel gave a beautiful, polished eulogy, speaking of a father he barely knew, and I listened with a quiet, detached sadness, a stranger at my own husband's memorial. After Michael was gone, my own health began a slow, graceful decline. It was not a battle against a specific illness, but a gentle fading, as if my soul, having completed its work, was preparing for its final journey. The big house became a quiet sanctuary. My days were measured by the rising and setting of the sun, by the comforting routine of my volunteer work at St. Jude's across the street. The children were my purpose. Their laughter, the music that filled the silence Michael had left behind. The director of the home, a warm, compassionate woman named Maria, became my closest friend, my confidant in those final years. I was not lonely. I was at peace. Daniel's weekly phone calls continued, a sterile 5-minute ritual of obligation. "How are you feeling, Mom? Are you eating enough? You know, Sarah and I found a wonderful assisted living community not far from us. We could send you a brochure." His suggestions for my future, the very ones I had overheard a decade ago, no longer stirred any anger in me. I would simply smile to myself and say, "That's nice, dear, but I am perfectly happy where I am." He was a stranger making small talk, completely unaware that the woman he was speaking to was already gone, her true self living in a world he could not see or understand. I knew my time was running out. In my final visit with Mr. Gable, I made sure everything was in order. The will was ironclad. The sealed letter, its contents known only to me, was affixed to it, waiting for its moment. I left specific instructions for my funeral, a simple service, with a request for donations to be made not to a cause for the elderly, but to the children's home. I passed away on a Tuesday in May, on Daniel's 51st birthday, a final quiet piece of poetry written by a force greater than myself. Daniel flew in for the funeral, his face a mask of appropriate somber grief. He was a man performing a sad but necessary duty. He expected a small gathering, a handful of my elderly friends, a few neighbors. Instead, the church was filled to capacity. He stood in the receiving line, shaking hands with dozens of people he had never met. He saw the entire staff of the St. Jude's Children's Home, their faces etched with genuine sorrow. He saw teenagers and young adults, former residents of the home who had come to pay their respects to the woman they called Miss Evelyn, the quiet, gentle woman who had read them stories, helped them with their homework, and believed in them when no one else had. He listened, confused, as person after person spoke not of Evelyn the mother, but of Miss Evelyn the beloved volunteer, the secret benefactor, the woman whose quiet generosity had transformed the lives of a generation of forgotten children. He was a stranger at his own mother's funeral, a minor character in the story of a life he now realized he knew nothing about. A week later, Daniel and Sarah sat in Mr. Gable's familiar wood-paneled office for the reading of the will. The grief, whatever small amount he had felt, had now been replaced by a sense of practical anticipation. There was the house to sell, the assets to liquidate. He and Sarah had already been discussing it on the flight over, making plans for the inheritance. A new summer home on the lake, an upgrade to a newer model of luxury car. It was, they felt, their due, the final, comfortable closing of a long and sometimes tedious chapter. Mr. Gable cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He put on his reading glasses and began to read from the document. The legal language was dry and formal, detailing the extent of my estate, the house, the savings, the investments, a portfolio worth a considerable sum. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a small, subtle, satisfied smile, and then Mr. Gable reached the final operative clause. All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, both real and personal, of whatsoever kind and wheresoever situated, I give, devise, and bequeath not to my son, Daniel Michael Thompson, but in its entirety to the St. Jude's Children's Home, located directly across the street from my late residence, to be used for the welfare, education, and happiness of the children in its care. The silence in the office was absolute. Daniel stared at the lawyer, his mind struggling to process the words. "What?" he stammered. A short, sharp, disbelieving sound. That can't be right. There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake, Daniel," Mr. Gable said softly. "The will is perfectly clear." Sarah's face was a mask of fury. She was senile. Clearly, she was not in her right mind. "We'll contest this." "I can assure you," Mr. Gable said, his voice turning to ice, "that your mother was in perfectly sound mind when she executed this will 10 years ago, and in every subsequent meeting we have had. She knew exactly what she was doing." He then reached into the folder and pulled out a single sealed white envelope. "She did, however, leave this for you, Daniel. She instructed me to give it to you only after the will had been read in its entirety." He slid the envelope across the polished desk. Daniel looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his name and his alone written on the front in his mother's familiar, elegant script. He was a man about to receive his inheritance after all. And it was far more terrible than he could have ever imagined. Daniel sat in the plush leather chair opposite Mr. Gable's desk, a man on the precipice of a comfortable future. His wife Sarah sat beside him, her feigned solemnity barely concealing a restless, greedy excitement. The last 10 years of dutiful calls and holiday visits were about to pay their dividend. He was a son about to receive his inheritance, the final comfortable closing of a long chapter of his life. He had no idea that he was not at the end of a chapter, but at the beginning of a sentence, a life sentence of regret, handed down by the quiet old woman he had so carelessly discarded. His hands, steady and confident just a moment before, trembled as he took the sealed white envelope. It was surprisingly light. He stared at his name on the front, written in his mother's elegant, familiar script, and a strange, cold dread began to creep up his spine. "Well, what is it?" Sarah hissed, her voice a sharp, impatient whisper. "What nonsense did the crazy old woman write?" He ignored her. With a deep breath, he tore the envelope open. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silent office. Inside was a single sheet of her favorite cream-colored stationery, the kind with a small embossed daisy in the corner. The page was not filled with accusations or angry paragraphs. There were only a few simple lines written in her perfect, steady hand. He began to read. "My dearest Daniel, on the evening of your 40th birthday, after we had shared what I believed was a warm and loving phone call, you made a small mistake. You forgot to hang up the phone. I stayed on the line for only a moment, but it was long enough. I heard you tell Sarah of your plans for me. I heard you call me that old woman, and I heard you say with such weary finality that you were so sick of me." Daniel's blood ran cold. The air in his lungs turned to ice. The memory, buried under more than a decade of self-satisfied obliviousness, came roaring back with perfect, horrifying clarity. He remembered the moment exactly. He remembered the casual, dismissive wave of his hand, the shared, knowing smirk with Sarah. It had been a throwaway comment, a moment of petty frustration, forgotten as soon as it was spoken, but his mother had heard. He continued reading, his eyes flying across the page, his world collapsing with each word. It was in that moment, listening to your true feelings, that my own finally became clear. You were so burdened by the thought of my future that I decided I must finally take control of my own legacy. The house and the savings that you saw as your inheritance were the fruits of a lifetime of love your father and I had for you. Since you had made it so clear that my presence in your life was a burden, I could not, in good conscience, leave you with the additional burden of my assets. And so I have sent my love and your inheritance to a home full of children who are still young enough to cherish a mother's affection. I have given everything to the children at St. Jude's, right across the street from the house you grew up in. For 10 years, I watched them play from my window. I hope this gift brings them some of the security and happiness that you so carelessly discarded. The letter ended with a final, devastatingly simple closing. It was not angry. It was not vengeful. It was, in its own way, the most loving and yet most damning sentence she could have possibly written. I love the little boy I raised more than life itself. I am so sorry he is gone. Goodbye, my son. Mom. The paper fluttered from his nerveless fingers and drifted to the floor. A choked, strangled sound escaped his throat. It wasn't senility. It wasn't a lawyer's manipulation. It was a single forgotten moment. It was a handful of cruel, careless words. It was all his own doing. The last 10 years of his life, the dutiful calls, the Christmas visits, the feigned concern, it had all been a hollow charade performed for a woman who had known the truth the entire time. She had watched him lie to her, year after year, her heart already broken beyond repair. "Daniel? What is it? What did she write?" Sarah demanded, her voice shrill. He couldn't answer. He stumbled to his feet and walked out of the lawyer's office, leaving Sarah to sputter in impotent fury. He walked out of the building and into the bright, indifferent sunlight. He didn't go to the airport. He didn't go back to his hotel. He got in his rental car and drove, his movements automatic, his mind a maelstrom of regret. He found himself parked on the quiet, tree-lined street where he had grown up. He got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, a broken man. He looked at the house, his mother's house. The house he had visited 100 times, the house he had always seen as a future asset, a line item in his financial plan. Then he turned and looked across the street. For the first time in his life, he truly saw it. The St. Jude's Children's Home, it wasn't just a brick building, it was alive. Children were playing on a bright new playground, their laughter carrying on the afternoon breeze. He saw a young woman, a caregiver, kneeling to comfort a small, crying boy. He watched as she wiped his tears and hugged him, a simple, profound act of love. His mother's love hadn't vanished. It hadn't died with her. It had simply moved across the street. It had been redirected to a place where it would be cherished, not resented. He had been so sick of his mother, and here were dozens of children who would give anything in the world for a mother to be sick of. He stood there for a long, long time, the letter a crumpled, sweaty ball in his fist. He had lost so much more than an inheritance. He had lost the past, for every memory was now a lie. He had lost the future, for it would be forever haunted by this moment. He had lost the pure, simple memory of a mother's unconditional love because he now knew with devastating certainty that it had one condition after all, the simple decency he had failed to show. Her last words echoed in his mind, a final, loving execution of the son he had become. I am so sorry he is gone. He finally was, too, and in the deafening silence of his own empty heart, he began his life sentence of regret. 5 years have passed since the day Evelyn Thompson's will was read in the quiet of my office. In my 40-year career as a lawyer, I have witnessed many family dramas unfold over inheritances, but none has left such a deep mark on my memory. Evelyn's story was not merely about money. It was a quiet, decade-long masterpiece of justice, consequence, and the true nature of a legacy. As expected, a storm followed the reading of the will. Sarah, Daniel's wife, was exactly as I had imagined her. Enraged, humiliated, and driven solely by greed, she immediately hired a prominent city law firm to contest the will. The lawsuit was based on standard, predictable arguments: undue influence and Evelyn's lack of testamentary capacity. They attempted to paint a picture of a lonely, grieving widow who had been duped by cunning administrators from the children's home. They demanded depositions, financial reports, and medical records. But Evelyn, in her quiet wisdom, had been prepared for this. She had foreseen their every move. On my advice, a year before her death, she had recorded a video deposition. In it, she sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea in her hands, and calmly and clearly explained the reasons for her decision. She did not speak of anger or revenge. She spoke of her love for the son he had been as a child, and of her decision to direct the fruits of her life to a place where love could still be accepted and valued. She was eloquent, intelligent, and absolutely of sound mind. When I presented this video deposition at the preliminary hearing, along with 10 years of medical assessments from her doctors attesting to her full capacity, the case fell apart. The judge dismissed the lawsuit, calling it frivolous and without merit. The public humiliation was the final straw for Sarah. Her marriage to Daniel, I understood, was built on a foundation of shared ambition and future wealth. When it became clear that there would be no inheritance and that their name was now associated with a high-profile scandal, the foundation cracked. 6 months after the lawsuit failed, I saw the divorce filing in the court documents. Sarah Thompson versus Daniel Thompson. She left, taking with her everything she still could, leaving Daniel alone to deal with the consequences of his fatal mistake. But while one family was falling apart, another, much larger, one was finding its future. The legacy of Evelyn and Michael poured into the St. Jude's Children's Home like a life-giving rain on parched earth. I became the legal advisor to the foundation created with her money, and I witnessed the transformation firsthand. Opposite Evelyn's old house, a new wing was built, the Evelyn and Michael Thompson wing. It housed a modern library, a computer lab, and, most touchingly, an art and music studio where the children could paint and play, a tribute to the dream Evelyn had once deferred. The Evelyn Thompson Scholarship Fund was established, guaranteeing a full college or trade school education for every child who aged out of St. Jude's. Children who had nothing were given a chance at a future they had never dared to dream of. The director of the home, Maria, often told me their stories of a girl who became the first in her family to go to university, of a boy who, thanks to a scholarship, was able to become a certified mechanic and open his own garage. Evelyn's legacy was not in the money itself, but in the lives it changed. It was the most beautiful revenge I had ever seen, a revenge through creation. And what of Daniel? He disappeared from view for several years. The scandal had cost him his job at the prestigious architecture firm, and the divorce, by all accounts, was difficult. He sold his luxury home to pay Sarah's settlement and moved somewhere up north. I thought I would never see him again. But about a year ago, he appeared in my office's reception area. He was a different man. The confident polish of his 40-year-old self had vanished, replaced by gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes. He was dressed in simple, clean clothes, and his gaze held neither arrogance nor anger, only a deep, endless fatigue. He did not come to plead or threaten. He came with a single quiet request. "Mr. Gable," he said, "may I have a copy of my mother's letter? I lost the original." I made a copy for him. He took it silently, thanked me, and left. I didn't see him again until last week. I was visiting my own parents' graves at the same cemetery where Evelyn and Michael are buried. From a distance, I saw a solitary figure standing before their headstone. It was Daniel. He wasn't crying. He was just standing there, under a gray November sky, reading the crumpled piece of paper, the copy of the letter. Then he did something I did not expect. He knelt, not to pray, but to work. He began to slowly and methodically pull the weeds that had sprouted at the base of the stone. He straightened the flowers in the vase. He wiped the granite with his handkerchief, cleaning away the traces of rain and dust. I realized then that his life sentence of regret was not a dramatic outburst, but a quiet daily penance. He had lost everything, and in the ruins he was finally, slowly, learning the most basic, decent act to care for the memory he had once so carelessly discarded. The inheritance he lost was money, but the legacy he was now, in his own broken way, trying to reclaim was something far more valuable, the right to be called a son. And that quiet, unending work at the graveside, I understood, had become his real life,